Hi, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. Thanks for joining us today in our Security Outcome Deep Dive webinar series. In the Deep Dive series, we will examine in more detail each outcome in our Identity Defined Security Outcome Library. Members of our technical working group team who develop the outcomes will join me to discuss the goals of the outcome and the various implementation approaches. My guests today are Morey, Haber, and Gregory. Morey is an IDSA technical working group member and BeyondTrust CTO and CISO. He has more than 25 years of IT industry experience and has authored 3 press books: Privileged Attack Vectors, Asset Attack Vectors, and Identity Attack Vectors. I like the last one. In addition to his internal role at BeyondTrust, Morey currently oversees BeyondTrust strategy for privilege access management and remote access solutions. Chris is also an IDSA technical working group member and Saviynt VP Channel Development and Operations. He supports Savynt's channel partners and technical alliances, leveraging his extensive knowledge of directory services, Azure, security, governance, and compliance. Chris joined Saviynt after an extensive career with Microsoft, working with Fortune 500 companies on collaboration, identity, and security initiatives. Hey guys, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Great to be here.
So before we get started with the conversation, I want to share a little bit about the IDSA. If you're already familiar with the IDSA, or perhaps if you've watched other of these deep dive series webinars, you can go ahead and skip ahead about 6 minutes and you'll get to the meat of the webinar today. So the IDSA exists to help organizations with the key challenges they are facing today. No secret that cybersecurity has become cumulatively challenging. The threats and vulnerabilities are a moving target. New technologies and defense mechanisms are introduced daily, and now with COVID-19, our traditional work environment has been turned upside down. Most organizations have been collecting identity and security tools over many years, solving the threat of the day, week, year. A single tool, single vendor approach is not working, as witnessed by the last challenge. The number of identities organizations manage and secure has exploded in the last 5 years, and the risks associated with those identities has as well. In our latest research, we found that 79% of organizations had suffered an identity-related breach in the last 2 years, which leads us to the need for a new approach to security. Identity has moved beyond an operational function and should now be considered a critical cybersecurity technology. It's important to recognize that every business transaction, attack surface, or target involves a credential and a service or piece of data. We can no longer sustain a one problem, one tool approach. Cybersecurity technologies must fundamentally work together if they are to achieve meaningful effectiveness. And lastly, we must operate with the mindset that the cumulative investment must make the whole more effective. We must share the intelligence, the identity context across the entire enterprise technology stack. So most people's perspective is that identity is really hard, but that's an out-of-date notion. The good news is that identity technologies have come a long way in the last 5 years. They're becoming easier to deploy and maintain. The identity and access management technology segments are working better together, and integration between identity technologies has improved as well. Our goal is to bridge what we see as a gap to security, not just the integration of identity with security technologies to improve your cumulative security spend, but to make you more secure through identity. So the IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, webinars, speaking engagements, an identity-centric security framework, which we'll talk a little bit more about here, which is vendor-agnostic best practices, security outcomes, and approaches. We share customer implementation stories. And lastly, our we aim to create a virtual community for sharing experiences and validation of identity-centric security approaches. The primary work product, as I mentioned, of our technical working group is the Identity-Defined Security Framework, which is made up of security outcomes, implementation approaches, and best practices. We make recommendations around best practices and security outcomes. However, we provide multiple alternatives to achieve the desired outcome through implementation approaches, and only you and perhaps your vendors can determine what approach is best for you. This is the library of security outcomes that we have published to date. The goal is to expand this library as a free community resource. The technical working group team will be adding to the library, but we also want to enlist the expertise of those living and working in the trenches and implementing identity security outcomes to add to it as well. And when we get to the end of this webinar, I'll talk to you about how you can join the mission. So today, we're going to dig into two of our security outcomes. All user access rights are continuously discovered, and all privileged user access rights are continuously discovered. So with that, let's bring the guys in to have a conversation. So Chris, we'll start with you. Let's talk about continuous discovery of user access. What is it and why is it important?
Well, I think you have to understand that with identity being the new perimeter and with all the implementations around least privilege and zero trust, you're constantly having to have a way to discover users' access if you're going to vet it against these security models. And when you need a way to continuously discover, there's a couple different ways you can do that, but you're actually making identity work for you and making security function to the level that you need it to function when you can automate how you're continuously discovering a user's access rights.
So Morey, I suspect there are nuances that come into play with privileged user access, given that those credentials are a hacker's primary target.
There are, and continuously discovering them is critical, because if you only do it as a snapshot in time, like a scan and report, then a threat actor that comes in, obtains privileges, uses them, and then tucks them away or removes them to try to stay out of the limelight or try to avoid detection really doesn't help you. So the continuous discovery and looking for those deltas and understanding when they're actually being used or basically being granted is key to preventing an attack.
Great. So I know from our research, a lot of organizations out there, the ones that are successful in their security strategies, depending on what you define as successful, are leveraging other common frameworks. Let me move to the next slide. Leveraging other common frameworks that may exist. How does this particular outcome apply to those common frameworks?
So
Chris, do you want to take that one? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Morey.
Yeah, I was going to just start it and pass it back over to Chris. The continuous discovery is key because the framework is basically outlining for you what you need to discover. It's the nuances of what you need to understand, certify, and produce an attestation report against. But it doesn't necessarily give you the technology or the methodology to do that continuous adaptive risk and trust assessment, that CARTA approach. So think of it as the dictionary or the definition, but the actual method to get there then becomes your implementation. And that varies greatly, and something that we'll talk about in a moment. Chris, I know you have some good input on that.
Yeah, Morey, I would say that the frameworks are just that, and don't take them out of context. They're swim lanes, recommendations, guidelines that produce a desired result as put forth by the research bodies and the security communities that generate them. To Morey's point, in the way to implement and the way in which you approach really is going to vary from customer to customer.
And when you consider the breaches that are listed on this slide and you dig into the details, don't be fooled. These clients understood the vast majority of their privileged, accounts. They understood the controls in place to protect them. But threat actors found a way to navigate around them, whether it was phishing, whether it was voice phishing, whether it was something that was not properly secured, whether it was a default configuration, whether it was a partner network. Those are all things that, while you have the definitions from the framework, the implementation to control them, manage them, monitor them, and assess changes in them is really the key that you have to think about.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Morey, because it's usually not the privileged account that's compromised out of the gate. It usually is the lowest common denominator. And then that account, once it's compromised, is used to perform reconnaissance, and they're always looking. You hear the term move laterally and move upward. The malicious individual is going to look to move laterally within an organization using that one account to gain access to other accounts, and then discover the privileged account, and then they go ahead and try to target that and attack that. So having a system in place that is always looking for effective access and constantly looking for change to detect those types of things is also going to be key in your security strategy, because it's great to put everything behind the wall and say we've got it covered with PAN, but when the lowest common denominator and you're not looking at all accounts, that's where you can run into trouble. It's a soft underbelly of identity, and you need to always be conscious of that if you're going to have a good security posture.
Agreed. So basically, Chris, and I think you and I would acknowledge this to all of our listeners, that any user account from guest and above has some form of privileges, some form of user access rights. And even those lowest level ones still need to be discovered, documented, and understood, because they can be leveraged for lateral movement and then escalated later by the threat actor. Would you agree?
I would totally agree. And I would say that could take, whether it's a contractor, a vendor, the lowest common denominator employee, an FTE, a retired person coming in through low-level system access, and all those accounts are all in play, right? And especially when you look at the current situation we're in with a drastic shift to working remote, now that need to collaborate has left a lot of accounts, whether they be vendor, consumer, business partner, as well as my own employees' remote workforce, needing to have that assessment and take that into account.
Agreed. So it's really everywhere.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So interesting. So, breaches obviously are on the top of everybody's minds, but, there's that sort of once a year, twice a year activity called an audit, internal audit. Are there common audit findings where this particular outcome can, smooth the waters for those yearly audits? How does this outcome help organizations become compliant?
Well, I think the organization, the burden of proof that's asked for by an auditor, when you have the ability to show and demonstrate all new accounts that have been added since the last time they were there, when you have the ability to drill down into and double click down into a specific account and review the access rights for the accounts that may have access to do certain functions, whether they be privileged or not, right? The privilege or what the user needs to do their job may not always be something that has an elevated. It could be something as basic as invite external parties to collaborate on certain documents and being able to review who's collaborating, and do we have these collaboration tools per se that my internal people have left and dismissed themselves from, and the external people are still there with the data still available to them for consumption. I mean, those are the types of things that you need to be able to pull and constantly have a baseline with a delta to show that rate of change and show what's changed and make sure that it's accurate, because accountability is what those frameworks are promoting, right? In that guideline, in that structure, they give you an outcome. And to get to that outcome, it's the accountability to the auditor when you say, oh, I'm SOC 2 compliant and we're following NIST controls and we're implementing least privilege. Okay, well, show me. It's the burden of proof what the auditor wants to see. And how do they see that is through continuous monitoring, continuous compliance, looking at that rate of change. And and understanding the rights/privileges that those users have on a continual basis versus a snapshot point in time, which is just that. It's a point in time. It's no good unless it's a continuous process if you're trying to take security seriously.
Excellent. Makes sense. So, yeah. So I want to, this is obviously a very important security outcome that organizations should clearly be focused on. And in our recent research project, Identity Security as a Work in Progress, we asked the question of organizations, how far along are you in implementing a subset of our security outcomes? And you can see the highlighted outcomes on the slide and the adoption. So Morey, any thoughts on the adoption of these two particular outcomes and, how far along organizations are today? Seems like they should be further.
I would hope it would be further, but it still shows that there's a lot of work to do in the identity, in the account, and the user access space. Really, when you do implement a technology here, you're going to find that when you're looking for privileged accounts, you're also going to get user access rights as well, and vice versa. It's normally the same tool set. It's how you use the data afterwards that becomes important, how you report on it, how you're satisfying one of your audit requirements, or even just doing basic security to look for shadow IT or other rogue accounts. When you look at the other statistics for in progress or in planning, you kind of realize that some people don't really know or understand that when you do select a tool or a methodology, you get the benefit of the other. And then they tend to focus on need to do just the users, or I've already done privileges, not realizing the benefit of an identity tool or a privileged access tool in satisfying both problems.
Yeah, when I look at it, I would think the same. As there seems to be a lot of work to do by a lot of organizations, and I thank the organizations who took the time to respond to this, because sometimes it's hard to answer these questions and openly admit where you are while you're anonymous. At the same token, it should, if this is a sampling that holds true, there is a lot of work to be done, and in this day and age of breaches, where it's harder and harder to ensure compliance and security and enforce those frameworks and have those frameworks actually work for you, it's time to roll up your sleeves and really address these issues seriously before you're the next breach and you're going to be suffering the consequences of the breach, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into the next slide. So we kind of took a different slice of the data, and one of the questions that we asked, think of it sort of as a demographic question in the research, was, what's your how would you define your security culture as it relates to identity? And those organizations, there was about a quarter of them, came back and said, we consider ourselves forward-thinking. And we asked forward-thinking and proactive and reactive. And the ones that identified themselves, again, self-selection, as forward-thinking, they reported only 34% breaches in the last 2 years. 34% of them had an identity-related breach in the last 2 years. Let me say that the right way. And so this is a slice of that data based on those organizations and how they define themselves. So as you can see, for these two particular outcomes, those organizations with fewer breaches were significantly farther along in implementing this particular outcome. So, it seems to me like those folks that have focused on this are definitely more secure. Any thoughts on that, Morey, that you'd like to add?
I would go back to what Chris was talking about and the time slice type problem. If anybody that's listening to this webinar has ever done vulnerability assessment or any type of audit where you have a slice in time, go check it out and report on it. Tomorrow, the next day, you could be in great shape, you could be in worse shape. And that's where we fail. That's where the management of identities has got to change for the sake of security. In terms of an audit, when you go down the path of I'm slicing the data now, and I'll go fix it 3 months from now, right before my next audit, that whole middle ground is where your exposure is, where you could have a problem. So thinking about this as that continuously discovered, which was a part of the question and a part of the forward thinking, there are great techniques to get there. And that's what we really need to think about in terms of the frameworks, how to embrace continuous discovery, and how to make sure it does help us when something does change so that we can react appropriately versus leaving that gap of exposure.
Perfect
yeah,
segue. And oh, go ahead. Sorry, Chris. Didn't mean to stop on you.
I agree with that. And the one thing that you see in the forward-thinking answers with the practical and reactive, from my point of view, there's still a lot of people in a reactive mode versus a forward-thinking proactive mode. And to sit there and wait for something bad to happen is the reactive response versus being proactive and go out and implementing the framework and doing constant discovery. And I know it's going to sound like Morey and I rehearsed this, but this process of continuous versus point in time, I can put this into an analogy of weather, and I can ask Morey on Monday, hey, how's the weather? And he says it's sunny. And I don't talk to Morey for 2 weeks. Do I assume it's sunny for the remaining 13 days between the last time I talked to him to take a look at it? No, because I'm sure it's rained. I'm sure he's had some storms. I'm sure it's been cloudy, maybe even snowed, depending on where he is. And I'm sure that things are going to change. And that's probably an analogy that you should apply to identity, right? Because just because it's good on a Monday doesn't mean it's going to be the same posture and you're adhering to the frameworks the same way on a Tuesday. And it could get better or worse on a Wednesday. So being able to track these trends enable you to put KPIs around your own implementations, which are going to drive the value of how you're implementing those frameworks and how well are these frameworks working for us. Because to implement them is a technical labor of love. And to put that out in the world, showing a KPI back to your organization that we implemented this framework, it cost us a little bit of money, but here's the KPIs, and we are successful, is only going to help you when it comes to gaining consensus for your next project, right? And your next initiative that's going to be identity or security based.
All right, let's talk about how we get there then. You talked about it being sort of a labor of love. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the first implementation approach that we have documented out on the website today?
Sure. The first is approach essentially is going to be the involvement of a local agent, right? A local agent is going to be used to collect data and, constantly be reporting back to a central system, and that's going to track those changes. It's going to compare data, current state to last state, look for delta, look for changes, be able to be configured for abnormalities, whether that's from a configuration database, whether that's from a security and policy framework when something is reported back that's different. And typically, these guys have the ability to alert, right, on that violation or that variance out of compliance. So when you look at it all up, an agent's going to be on every single system. I would say, you also have the ability, instead of having an agent, to compare against a configuration database as well. But at the same token, the local agent is going to be the one that does it. And you can see that, target systems are going to have to be maintained. It's crying for configuration management, systems management. A role entitlement catalog has been developed or is in play. There's a healthy approval process to gain access to resources that can be risk mitigating, intelligent, leverage AI, machine learning to take care of outliers and only focus on risky entitlements. And you can also get into the attribute and policy defined. Whether someone's going to have a certain attribute or a certain policy element applied to them that's going to give them. Now, the biggest piece to look at is these service accounts and what they can do. And when you start to look at service accounts, is manage those identities, whether they're silicone or they're non-persona, and they understand where they are, what they run, what systems they're installed on. And that goes with that always monitoring piece, right? If I know I've got a an Azure or a master account in AWS that's got some elevated privilege, I should always be conscious of where that account's used, when it's used to install, etc.
And the one interesting thing about this local software agent approach for doing all of this is it has to be on a supported operating system. While it provides the best granularity to doing this continuous piece, you have to think of it as running in your traditional Windows, Unix, Linux, Mac, etc. environments. If the technology stack does not support agent, whether it's a router, switch, container, some other type of microcode, you have to find a different approach. And that's one of the things in the framework that's so important, is because you have to consider continuous discovery across all of your infrastructure, all of your cloud, and not just your, commercial operating systems.
Thanks, Morey. I move forward to the slide where we show the privileged user access side of things using a local software agent approach. Is there anything else you want to add to that, or pretty much covered it?
When you're dealing with it, sure. When you're dealing with it outside of the traditional user access, and now you're talking about privileges, you're not only talking about the operating system, but you also need to consider the applications that are running on that as well, and including hard-coded applications or scripts, etc. So you're basically distributing another form of agent technology, and it's also going to normally work with your asset management system. So as a part of that compliance initiative that Chris and I were talking about, this will help drive asset management, whether that is in a SaaS application or legacy on-premise, far beyond just doing asset management in a spreadsheet. And you also need to make sure that when you're doing it in this context, you're looking for those deltas, those small changes, and the agent is perfectly configured to do so, but part of that is having that network connectivity to talk back to a privileged access solution or your asset inventory, not only to get the changes, but also potentially rotate credentials or any other PAM functions that would be present. So a variety of vendors support this, but the key point here is you're looking for those keys to the kingdom, those highly elevated privileged accounts, and they're not just in the operating system, they're on anything that might be actually executing on that host as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say too, because we're talking about PAM, and when you start to look at the cloud, and all these other things, discovering rights in the cloud, it could be having agent monitor certain functions, right? A move set of VMs from zone to zone, change configurations, things of that nature, those elevated functions also could be something you monitor with an agent, right? Just constantly query the elevated privilege itself and see when a user account moves into it, especially if it's not a designated user who should be doing that, a vendor account or contractor account that gets moved in without change control, etc. You have the ability to enforce your policy there as well.
And I also look at the agent approach for the previous and this one is pretty much the migration of what we would consider legacy technology to legacy technology in the cloud. But going to the cloud or going to operating systems that don't support agents, there are better approaches.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julie.
Yep, moving on to the next one. So the other approach that we've got documented is around agentless discovery via an API. So Morey, you want to keep going on this one? I suspect this is where you're headed.
This is exactly it. And this will go into the similar type of discussion of user to privileges, and I'll pass it back to Chris to handle the privilege side. But when you're doing it via API, you're talking directly to the target system, and it has to have a compatible API that can enumerate the users, the access, the privileges, and it may even give more granular data. In many cases, in the cloud specifically, this is called side channeling, and there's a tremendous amount of benefits to doing so because you're not installing that agent, you're not responsible for maintaining or updating an agent like in the previous discussion, and you're also not potentially paying for the CPU runtime because you're querying an API to get this information out. So you have to have the connectivity, the API for it has to support it, but basically you now can work with almost any solution. Any instance, container, or anything else that's running in the cloud, even if it doesn't support the agent, can potentially extract that because the API is going to allow you to go in and even look at flat files or scripts that might have RESTful API or Graph API calls for accounts built in. It's also incredibly friendly for CASBs and other type of protection technologies that you may be having for the cloud as well. Now, one thing that's important is when you do pull all this information back, you're going to have a list just like the agent presents. However, you're not going to have anything there that can necessarily react. You're not going to have any agent there that can potentially change access rights unless the API itself allows you to make those modifications. So you have to be aware of your potential restrictions, what it means and what it's going to take to do remediation at some point, and also, again, pay special attention to service accounts and other accounts, whatever the privilege level may be, that might be assigned rights, because they're going to operate in that same context where, if owned, lateral movement or other type of surveillance could occur.
Yeah, certainly, Morey. Those are great. Yeah, those are great points. And the one thing I would say when you're looking at the API, it's easier to connect into an AWS and Azure GCP environment and look at the environment holistically and extend your NIST and compliance framework controls to it. Just because you're discovering, you have to do a lot of work with the data you discover, right? And if the API is just doing discovery, that change is going to have to be done by another arm, right? And it's good to discover because the cloud in itself is ubiquitous. It's an N+1. It's designed for dynamic development and presentation. And if you go back and look at some of the biggest breaches that have happened, it's through multiple dev teams working on an instance that was in test that never could have been moved to prod with a misconfigured share configuration. And the next thing you know, it's live application, it's in the wild, and it's got a weak security posture because nothing was being done to continuously discover how would this act against the desired security configuration and outcome that these people needed to have, and what should have been their security posture in a public cloud environment.
Okay, and then our last one, again, just focusing on agentless discovery via API and as it relates to privileged accounts. And Morey, you talked in general. Do you want to talk specifics about PAM and this implementation approach?
Yeah, the implementation approach for the API goes one level above, and I know Chris and I are going to have maybe a slightly different opinion here, but I think the outcome is the same. Because when we're talking about privileged accounts now, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, that you're communicating with the API, you're talking about what's running. But where we might actually differ in the conversation is not only what's running, but what does the management infrastructure look like? And are you even allowed to do anything with it? Specifically, let's talk about the cloud, the hypervisors, the management consoles, and all the supporting stuff that you do not own that may need privileged access discovery. The management from an identity side is quite different because you don't own it. You are only able to assess it. You may not be able to control it. And your privileged access rights are something that might change based on some even form of maintenance that SaaS application, that hypervisor, that infrastructure provider, or even that platform provider may be doing. Look, if you've got an infrastructure service out there that you're paying for and they're doing regular maintenance and you're doing privileged access rights, continuous discovery, you might find your accounts get disabled at some times so that they can do maintenance because they don't want you to break something while they're actually doing it. So you need the API to be able to go in there and see it, but your continuous approach might show results that are unusual. And from an identity standpoint, that can get tricky. You might have to be able to provide certification reporting that says, yep, I'm using cloud provider X, and on Saturday nights from 12 to 1, all my stuff gets disabled on a routine basis, and that's because they're doing their maintenance. That makes it much different than just standard user rights management. So you have to expose the API not only for the stuff that you're running, but for the management systems themselves. You have to be able to differentiate between the targeted APIs for privileged accounts, not only, again, what you're running, but what also you may be buying. And this is, again, where Chris, from an identity perspective, will look at it very differently than I would from a privileged access perspective. And you have to make sure that when you're doing this type of configuration, you're protecting the API as a privileged account itself to do so. If the vendor is giving you a certificate to communicate with the API and you're not managing that certificate or not rotating it or not keeping it under good control, then that leakage of that certificate or that key could become a liability for your organization and another attack vector for that hacker. Chris?
Yeah, and I would say there's a concept that is really going to help people. It's called just-in-time. When you're talking about the ability to have the very heavily privileged accounts that are in, that have broad, I'd say, scope in a cloud environment, like the hypervisors, the ability to manage machines moving between zones, turn machines on and off, add services to machines, etc. All of these extended administrative functions, there is a concept that you can take from an identity side called just-in-time, right? And I'm stealing that a little bit from the zero trust, but one of the core principles of zero trust is just-in-time access. And if you're truly going to implement zero trust, you can extend that into these privileged sessions as well and have just-in-time enablement of an account or just-in-time provisioning or deprovisioning of an account to perform a specific function to maintain that security posture as well. So like Morey said, a little bit of a variance, but at the same token, when we said at the very beginning, there's multiple ways to solve these problems. There's multiple ways to adhere governance and compliance and extend these frameworks out and achieve your desired results as customers. And no two customers do it the same. So that's, I think, great conversation, Morey, and great topic. Thank you.
Great. So as you mentioned, no two customers do it the same, but based on our research, we did find that folks that are putting a focus on this particular security outcome were more secure. And so you kind of think, well, how is it that I can become forward thinking? And we put together several steps to follow that can help you on your journey to becoming more secure through identity. So discovering all of your identity types, so make sure to include human, employees, customers, third parties, and non-humans, application, service, IoT. Identify the vulnerability and risk associated with each identity type. And with the shift to remote workforce, this may have changed. And of course, your corporate resources too. Establish your current state against the identity-defined security outcomes that we recommend. Create a roadmap and work with your solution provider and vendors to determine capabilities and identify the gaps. And lastly, make sure that you're measuring your success in implementing the desired outcome. So guys, I want to thank you for joining today. This is a great conversation. I knew it would be. Before we sign off, I wanted to point you to additional resources that support the discussion today. The research report that we referenced several times, Identity Security, a Work in Progress, and several blogs that you can find on our website, as well as in the attachment section underneath this Bright Talk webinar. So we would love your feedback. We, as I mentioned earlier, are continuing to grow these outcomes in our library. This is a free resource available to the practitioner community, and we would love to have your voice included in these outcomes and what areas you are focusing on and how we can help you be successful. So thanks again for joining us today. You'll find the slides to the webinar posted along with the other resources in the Bright Talk webinar. So thanks again, and make sure that you follow our library or follow our channel, excuse me. We'll be adding to this deep dive series over the next several months. Thanks so much.
Thank you.